I didn't scream when it happened. I couldn't. I just sat there staring at something that proved my whole life was never safe. This wasn't a small hurt. It took my marriage, my savings, my sense of who I was. Years of building, trusting, believing, gone without noise, quiet, clean, intentional. The person closest to me knew exactly what they were doing. They smiled every day while something irreversible was already in motion. I lost more than money. I lost stability. I lost the future I planned my body and mind around. What hurts most isn't the loss itself. It's knowing it was allowed to happen. Legal. Documented. Signed. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't beg. I didn't warn them. I started watching. Before any of this happened, my name was Emily. I was someone people called steady, reliable, the kind of woman who others leaned on when things felt uncertain. I liked routines, small comforts, planning ahead. I believed that if you built carefully, life would hold. I wasn't impulsive with people. I chose slowly, trusted deeply, and held loyalty like it was a shield. That applied to friends, family, and my marriage. I didn't live in suspicion. I thought suspicion belonged to broken relationships. Trust was a commitment, not a question. My friendships were quiet and enduring. I showed care through consistency, listening, remembering details, being present. I didn't need dramatics to prove my devotion. In my marriage, trust felt mutual. We talked about money, plans, long-term security. I believed we were partners, building the same future. I didn't monitor accounts, check emails, or ask for constant proof. Vigilance wasn't part of my life because I didn't see the need for it. Looking back, the early warning signs were subtle, easy to dismiss, conversations that ended too neatly, decisions that had already been made before I was aware. I sometimes felt oddly left out but blamed myself. I told myself I needed to relax, to trust more, to stop overthinking. Peace, I had been taught, comes from acceptance, not questioning. One evening, I remember sitting across from him, talking about nothing significant. I felt a strange distance, a door quietly closing somewhere I couldn't see. I ignored it. Nothing obvious was wrong, so I convinced myself it was nothing. Life moved forward as normal. That's the thing about careful betrayal. It doesn't arrive with alarms. It happens in quiet, ordinary moments while you live as if nothing has changed. The first real crack came during a routine task I had completed dozens of times before. I wasn't looking for trouble, just verifying details. I expected to skim, confirm, and move on. Then I saw it. At first, my brain refused to believe it. I assumed I misread something. I reread it slowly, then again. The numbers, the language, they were precise, clean, and completely wrong. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. My chest tightened. My hands went cold. I told myself there had to be a simple explanation. There always is. That's how life had worked until then. I read every line carefully. The conclusion was undeniable. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't oversight. It was deliberate, structured, intentional. I felt dizzy, not with panic, but with the collapse of understanding. The ground beneath me had shifted without warning. I stood up. Sitting felt impossible. I placed the papers down carefully, as if touching them too quickly would shatter reality. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just stood there trying to reconstruct a life that had quietly been rewritten. And then it hit me. This hadn't begun yesterday. It had been happening while I lived normally, while I trusted, while I believed our plans were aligned. The person I loved most hadn't made a mistake. They had built something carefully, quietly, to exclude me. I remember whispering my own name, Emily, as if saying it out loud could anchor me back to the person I had been before this moment. I realized then that everything I believed about stability, trust, and partnership had been conditional on my ignorance. And in that instant, I felt the first real wave of shock, the kind that silences thought, that makes the body feel heavier than gravity alone should allow. Everything familiar looked the same. and yet nothing was as I had known it. I didn't move for a long time. I didn't speak. I just stared at the papers, at the proof, at the life that had already been quietly rearranged without me. This was the first undeniable truth. The betrayal was real, and it was just the beginning. After that moment, nothing collapsed loudly. That's what made it harder. Life kept moving as if nothing had shifted, while I walked around carrying knowledge that changed the shape of everything. I went to work the next day. I answered emails. I smiled when spoken to. Inside, I felt like I was leaking something invisible, a slow drain. Every familiar interaction reminded me that I was now living with information I couldn't share without destroying the surface of my life. At night, the weight arrived. That's when my body reacted. Tight chest, shallow breath, a constant replay of what I'd seen, like my mind was trying to convince itself it wasn't real. I kept hoping I'd wake up and realize I misunderstood something basic. A column, a clause, a line I read too quickly. But each time I checked again, it became clearer. The first real fallout wasn't emotional, it was practical. Money I believed was secure wasn't where I thought it was. Assets I assumed were shared were structured in a way that quietly excluded me. I realized how much of my sense of safety had been outsourced to trust. I hadn't protected myself because I didn't think I needed to. That realization came with guilt, a deep, uncomfortable guilt. I blame myself for being naive, for not asking harder questions, for believing that love meant transparency by default. I replayed every moment I'd chosen ease over clarity and wondered if this was the cost of that choice. Then came the first twist. I found evidence that this didn't start recently. It had been in motion long before the small changes I remembered noticing. The decisions weren't reactive, they were preemptive. Arranged during a time I believed we were strongest. That detail hurt more than the loss itself. It meant the version of the relationship I cherished existed alongside a parallel reality I was never meant to see. While I was planning a future, someone else was quietly planning an exit that didn't include my consent. The second twist arrived through timing, dates that lined up too perfectly, actions taken shortly after specific conversations, moments where reassurance was followed almost immediately by paperwork that contradicted it. I realized comfort had been strategically placed. Calm delivered right when it was needed to keep me still. I started questioning my own memories. Had I missed signs because I didn't want to see them? Or because I was deliberately kept in the dark? That uncertainty did something to my confidence. I stopped trusting my reactions. Even my anger felt suspicious to me, like maybe I didn't deserve it. I told myself to be fair, to be rational, to consider explanations I hadn't heard yet. But explanations require honesty, and honesty was already missing. The third twist was personal in a way I wasn't prepared for. Someone else knew, not just vaguely, not accidentally. Someone who had sat with me, laughed with me, listened to me talk about plans that were already compromised. They didn't warn me. They didn't intervene. They watched. I remember feeling a cold kind of grief then. The loss of safety wasn't limited to my marriage. It extended outward, infecting my sense of community. I realized how alone I actually was inside what I thought was a shared life. Trust didn't just break, it disintegrated. I started questioning every interaction from the past, wondering who else might have known, who chose silence, who benefited from my ignorance. The world felt suddenly transactional, like I had misunderstood the rules everyone else was playing by. My reputation began to shift quietly too, not publicly, not obviously. I noticed subtle changes in how I was treated, conversations that stopped short, assumptions made without consulting me. I wasn't openly discredited, but I was being slowly erased from decisions that used to include me. That was when I understood how power works when it's exercised politely. No confrontation, no accusations, just exclusion, just positioning. I felt embarrassed. Not because I'd done something wrong, but because I'd believed in something that turned out to be one-sided. That kind of embarrassment is isolating. You don't want to admit it. You don't want to be seen as someone who missed what now feels obvious. The fourth twist came when I realized how carefully my image had been managed. I wasn't just excluded financially, I was framed in subtle ways, through language, through documentation, through narratives that painted me as uninvolved, uninterested, passive, not unkind, just conveniently absent. It was a version of me that made my exclusion seem reasonable. Seeing myself described that way felt like being erased while still alive. I started doubting my own worth, wondering if I really had been as disengaged as the record suggested, if my contributions mattered less than I thought, if I had exaggerated my role in my own life. That doubt was the most dangerous part, because it almost stopped me from looking deeper. Almost. But once the illusion was gone, I couldn't unsee patterns. Every new detail confirmed the same truth. This wasn't a single betrayal, it was a system. A series of choices made over time, designed to protect one person's interests at the expense of mine. And it was all done without raising a voice. I felt grief then, not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind that settles into your bones. Grief for the person I was before this knowledge, the woman who believed stability meant safety, who thought trust was enough. I stopped sleeping properly. I stopped planning. The future felt like something I wasn't qualified to imagine anymore, but beneath the confusion, something else started forming. Not anger, not yet. Clarity. And with it, a question that wouldn't leave me alone. If this was built so carefully, what else was hidden? After that question settled in me, I stopped reacting. Not because the pain disappeared, but because I understood something important. Emotion was the only thing I couldn't afford to waste. I became quieter, not withdrawn in a way anyone could accuse, just observant, present, careful. I listened more than I spoke. I asked neutral questions. I let people explain things twice, sometimes 3 times without interrupting. Silence became useful. Inside, there was constant pressure. Anger tried to surface, sharp and fast, but I kept it contained. Anger wanted relief. I wanted clarity. I reminded myself daily that nothing meaningful would come from an outburst. Not justice, not safety, not truth. So I watched. I noticed patterns I hadn't seen before. How information traveled, who spoke confidently and who deferred. Which topics were redirected gently away from me. It wasn't paranoia, it was mapping. I wasn't imagining threats anymore, I was identifying structures. At night, I wrote things down. Not accusations, just facts. Dates without dates. Actions without interpretation. What was said, what followed, what changed. Over time, those notes began to form a shape. The betrayal wasn't loud, but it was consistent. There were moments when doubt crept back in, when I wondered if I was becoming unfair, if my silence was turning me into someone cold. I had been raised to believe that goodness meant generosity, that love meant giving people the benefit of the doubt. I struggled with that. I asked myself hard questions. Was I planning revenge, or was I seeking balance? Was I protecting myself, or punishing someone else? I didn't want to become the kind of person who justified harm just because it was clever. That moral hesitation slowed me down, and I let it. I needed to be certain that what I was doing was rooted in truth, not bitterness. The more I observed, the clearer it became that I didn't need to invent anything. The truth already existed. It was documented, filed, signed. My role wasn't to expose with force, but to allow facts to surface in the right order. That realization calmed me. I began to understand the difference between revenge and consequence. Revenge is fueled by anger. Consequence is fueled by reality. One is chaotic, the other is inevitable. So I chose reality. I gathered information patiently. I didn't confront. I didn't hint. I let confidence grow on the other side, the dangerous kind that comes from believing you've won quietly. That confidence made mistakes more likely, oversights, assumptions. I noticed when caution faded. Emotionally, I felt split. Outwardly steady, inwardly grieving. There were days I mourned the relationship as if it had ended, even though it technically hadn't. I felt foolish for missing someone who was still present but no longer real. Sometimes I wanted to scream the truth just to stop pretending, to shatter the illusion and be done with it. But I knew that would only protect the very thing that hurt me. Chaos favors those already prepared. I wasn't prepared yet. Instead, I focused on my own stability. I reviewed what was still mine, what I could legally protect, where my name still mattered. It was humbling to realize how much I had taken for granted and empowering to realize how much still remained untouched. Every small step restored a piece of my confidence. There were moments of temptation, opportunities to embarrass, to leak, to hint. I declined them quietly. Public humiliation would have felt satisfying for a moment, but it would have framed me as emotional, reactive. That narrative was already waiting to be used against me. I refused to hand it over. I started to see how truth works when it's patient. It doesn't need volume, it needs timing. I understood that when facts emerge without anger attached, they carry more weight. They force people to reckon rather than defend. That became my guiding principle. The hardest part was restraint around affection. Familiar gestures still existed. Shared space, shared history. Sometimes kindness showed up unexpectedly, and it confused me. I wondered if remorse existed somewhere beneath the strategy. Those moments tested me. I asked myself whether stopping now would be mercy or self-betrayal. Whether forgiveness without accountability was healing or denial. I didn't want to punish remorse if it was real, but I also couldn't ignore the system that had already harmed me. In the end, I chose consistency over hope. I reminded myself that love doesn't require secrecy, and remorse doesn't require silence. If change was possible, it wouldn't depend on my ignorance. As weeks passed, the plan became less about action and more about readiness. I aligned things quietly. I ensured that when the truth surfaced, it wouldn't be filtered through my emotions, but through records that spoke for themselves. I felt a strange peace then, not happiness, not relief, just steadiness. The anger softened into resolve. I wasn't trying to destroy anyone. I wasn't rewriting history. I was simply stepping out of the role I had been assigned without consent. The truth didn't need my voice raised. It just needed space. And I was almost ready to give it that. When the truth began to surface, it didn't arrive like an explosion. It arrived like paperwork. A request here, a clarification there. A routine process that suddenly required documentation that had always been assumed, never examined. Nothing unusual on the surface, nothing that demanded attention. That was the beauty of it. No one panics when things look normal. I stayed quiet. I let processes do what emotions never could. The first lie collapsed gently, not exposed, corrected. Someone asked a reasonable question, an answer was given that relied on an assumption. The assumption didn't hold up, a file was reviewed, a timeline didn't match, no accusation followed, just silence, followed by another question. I watched confidence hesitate for the first time. It wasn't visible to everyone, only to someone who knew what confidence used to look like. I recognized it immediately. The pause before speaking, the extra explanation that wasn't needed. That was when I knew the structure was weakening. Soon after, another detail surfaced. Not because I revealed it, but because it could no longer stay buried. A document contradicted a narrative that had been repeated casually for years. Again, no drama, just confusion, a polite request for clarification, an email copied to the wrong set of people. That was when reputations began to shift. Quietly, conversations changed tone. Trust didn't vanish, but it thinned, the kind of thinning you can't argue against because nothing overt has happened yet. People started double-checking instead of assuming. They started asking for things in writing. That's when lies struggle the most. I remained consistent, calm, cooperative, almost invisible. I answered what I was asked and nothing more. I didn't volunteer information. I didn't correct assumptions that worked in my favor. I let accuracy do its slow work. The second layer collapsed when someone else tried to protect the story. They repeated it too confidently, too smoothly, and someone noticed, not me. Someone who had no emotional investment, only procedural responsibility. They flagged an inconsistency. Just a note. Just a mark. That mark spread. Suddenly, the story needed defending, and defending requires energy. The more energy it took, the more obvious it became that something was wrong. Truth rarely needs protection. Lies always do. I felt something unexpected then, not satisfaction, distance. It no longer felt personal. The system was doing what systems do when fed incorrect information. It was rejecting it. Slowly, methodically. Reputation doesn't collapse in public. It erodes in private. Meetings I wasn't in began ending differently. Decisions paused, approvals delayed. People stopped attaching certainty to a name that once carried authority. Nothing dramatic, just caution, and caution is dangerous for anyone who relies on unchecked trust. The third collapse came through alignment. Stories that had been told separately no longer matched when placed side by side. Not because anyone was digging aggressively, but because alignment was suddenly required. Timelines overlapped, motives conflicted. Someone asked why a choice had been made one way, when the justification suggested another. No one accused anyone of lying. They didn't need to. The discomfort became visible, not to everyone, but to those who knew how to read it. A forced calm, an over-polished explanation, a tendency to speak longer than necessary. That's when credibility starts bleeding. I felt the weight of it then, not triumph, but gravity. This was real, irreversible. The truth wasn't just known, it was now circulating without me. I realized something important at that moment. I was no longer the center of this story. That was the consequence of choosing facts over anger. The narrative wasn't about betrayal anymore. It was about reliability, about integrity, about risk. And risk changes how people behave. The fourth layer didn't fall all at once. It dissolved, access changed, authority narrowed, influence softened. Not taken away, redirected. Someone else was asked to review, someone else was copied. Oversight appeared where autonomy used to exist. That kind of shift feels small from the outside. From the inside, it's devastating. I never confronted anyone. There was nothing to say. The facts were already speaking in rooms I wasn't in, and they spoke more clearly without my presence. There was no angry spouse to discredit, no emotional reaction to dismiss, just records, timelines, signatures, and silence. I noticed how people treated me differently too, with more care, more listening, not out of pity, out of recalibration. They were reevaluating what they thought they knew, and that included me. I didn't correct them. I didn't need to. The final consequence didn't arrive like punishment. It arrived like limitation. Opportunities stopped expanding. Trust stopped renewing automatically. Decisions once made alone now required explanation. Nothing was revoked. Nothing dramatic happened. But the future changed shape. That's when I understood what accountability really looks like. It doesn't shout. It narrows options. It reduces room for manipulation. It replaces freedom with scrutiny. And scrutiny is permanent. I felt a quiet release then. Not joy, closure. I hadn't destroyed anyone. I hadn't exposed anything publicly. I had simply stepped aside and allowed the truth to function without obstruction. What collapsed wasn't a person. It was a version of reality that depended on my silence. And once silence was no longer necessary, everything else followed naturally. By the time the full truth surfaced, it didn't feel like a reveal. It felt like confirmation. Nothing new was discovered in that final phase. Everything had already been there. Documents aligned, timelines clarified, decisions traced back to their origin. What changed was that no alternative explanations remained. The story that once required my silence to survive had nowhere left to hide. The person who betrayed me didn't confess. They didn't need to. The record spoke clearly enough. What surprised me most was how ordinary the exposure felt. There was no confrontation scene, no dramatic reckoning, just a quiet shift in how reality was acknowledged. People stopped asking if something was wrong and started discussing what to do about it. That's when consequences become real. The systems that once protected them turned neutral. And neutrality, when you've relied on advantage, feels like punishment. Oversight replaced autonomy. Trust became conditional. Each decision now carried a shadow it never had before. I watched from a distance, not detached, but grounded. I felt grief still, but it had changed shape. It was no longer sharp. It was heavy and settled, like something acknowledged rather than resisted. The full truth wasn't just about money or control. It was about intent. It became undeniable that this hadn't been a misunderstanding or a series of small mistakes. It was a deliberate restructuring of my life without my knowledge, a quiet removal of consent, a belief that I wouldn't notice or wouldn't matter enough to challenge it. That belief was the final miscalculation. The consequences were irreversible, not because anyone sought revenge, but because trust, once broken at that level, does not regenerate. It changes how people are seen, permanently, even when nothing is said out loud. Opportunities closed politely. Doors stopped opening automatically. The reputation that once carried ease now carried weight. Every move required justification. Every success was examined more closely. Nothing illegal was undone, but everything was recontextualized. That is how accountability works when it's real. For me, justice didn't arrive as satisfaction. It arrived as balance. I regained what could be regained. I secured what remained vulnerable. I stood on my own name again, not as an extension of someone else's narrative, but as a complete person. The emotional cost lingered longer than the financial one. I had to grieve the version of myself who trusted without question. The woman who believed love and fairness naturally aligned. I didn't become bitter, but I became precise. I learned that silence can be protective and patience can be powerful. I also learned that restraint is not weakness. It is strategy with integrity. There were moments I wondered if forgiveness was required to finish healing. I realized later that forgiveness is optional. Clarity is not. Healing came from knowing the truth fully and no longer doubting my own perception. The betrayer continued living. Of course they did. There was no dramatic downfall, no public disgrace, just a smaller world, narrower margins, a future that would always be monitored, never assumed. And that was enough, because the life I lost was rebuilt on different terms, slower, more deliberate, with boundaries that didn't require explanation. I stopped apologizing for needing transparency. I stopped minimizing my right to understand what affects my life. What stayed with me most was the quiet power of letting facts speak. I didn't need to prove pain. I didn't need to perform outrage. I didn't need to convince anyone of my worth. The truth did that work for me. Looking back, I understand now that the betrayal didn't take everything I built. It took what was never protected. What survived was stronger than what was lost. I don't tell this story for sympathy. I tell it because silence protects the wrong person far too often. I didn't win by destroying someone else. I won by refusing to disappear. And when the truth finally settled into place, calm and undeniable, there was nothing left to say because everything that mattered was already known.